Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's Joanne Duklas here from the GDN Conversation series. I'm so excited to have you join us today with our wonderful group of panelists as we explore the space of opening up recognition beyond traditional practices and flexing our muscles a little bit to help with lifelong learning, rapid access for learners to work and education. Welcome, friends, and I know your bios are on our website, but I'd love for you to share with me. And I'm going to start with Christine. Tell me, Christine, where do you work and what brought you to this work?
Wonderful. Thank you, Joanne. I'm excited to be here with everyone. I work at Memorial University in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm an associate professor in post-secondary studies and student affairs and services, but also at the moment, I'm the interim associate vice president, academic and dean of students. What brought me to this work with regard to student mobility and credit transfer, I had a friend when studying in undergrad at Brock University and Niagara College. And with that, at Brock University in Niagara, I had a friend who actually decided after 2 years of study to move to Florida. And when his family moved to Florida, he realized that after 2 full years of a base university education, he received about 5 courses for credit recognition. In that moment, I realized that maybe I wasn't going to be a high school teacher and that I really needed to investigate and research this area a little more. Luckily for me, it was the moment of the Bologna Accord. In the European Union's tuning project. And so I was very lucky during that time to actually go on to work at the Higher Education Quality Council of Ontario, HECO, and actually undertake some of this work with regard to tuning and outcomes and some of the institutional profiles for the institutions in Ontario. I actually went on to complete my doctorate in this area and postdoctoral fellow in this area. This work has been something that I've done for a long time with the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer and the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Articulation and Transfer, as well as a ROOC. And this has been a wonderful opportunity to explore what's occurring in Canada across provinces, as well as within our home, and realizing that there is a good amount of work to do in this field.
You know, it's funny. I think that's when I met you when you were working on the tuning project. That
It
was a
was.
while back.
That was the time.
It's funny you brought back memories when I thought of that. Nan, it's so lovely to have you. Thank you for joining. I consider it my luck to have met you recently and gotten to know you better. Tell us more about why you do what you do and what brought you to this work.
Sure. And thank you so much for including me in this opportunity. So I'm Nan Travers, and I'm at SUNY Empire State University in the United States. So please don't hold that against me right now. And I also am co-chair for Credential As You Go. What brought me into this work is the whole idea of being able to recognize people for what they know and can do, and to move that more into a formal kind of a credentialing and recognition process. When people are not recognized and when they are not credentialed, they become invisible. And when we look at people across, at least in my country, it's 1 out of 6 people, adults in our country, that have some higher education and no credential. And as a result, they are totally held back from being able to move forward, both with work and continuing education. And then another 2 out of 6 have not had any higher education. And again, really become invisible and not being able to be recognized for what they know and can do. So that was the work that kind of led up the reasons that we developed Credential As You Go, which is a national project that's working. We have 54 members in our network working to really transform the nation's credentialing system to embrace all credentials, everything from a badge all the way up to a degree, and looking at it from both workforce and also higher education, and really thinking about how are all the different ways that we can create formal recognitions for people so that they can be able to move forward in work and in continuing their education.
I love the concept of helping people be visible, helping them be recognized. That confidence building that goes along with that is very powerful. So I can appreciate what you're saying and where you're coming from. And it's interesting having a Canadian perspective as well as an American perspective. And Dawn, I would consider you're also one of the world perspectives at the table, along with myself and my colleagues. You and I recently bumped shoulders again at your wonderful convening in Paris, as well as the good work you're doing in this space. Tell us a bit about it and tell us what brought you here.
Sure. I was just reflecting. It was kind of about there, very near the Eiffel Tower, and that's where we'll be again this October. So it's interesting hearing these origin stories because I came at this notion of being able to demonstrate what you know and can do and be recognized for that through a couple of different doorways. I began in ed tech with TVO back in the 90s. I like to say I dragged them kicking and screaming onto the internet in 1994 when they were worried about the satellite cable universe. And I said, there's something else. There's this thing called the internet. By way of Red River College in the early 2000s. But I got into telling people's career stories. So I came at this notion of portfolios through career education because I was telling people in careers their stories so kids could learn from that and think about, how I might get into that and whether I might like that career versus another career. And did these things called Career Destination Manitoba, Career Destination Franco, Ontario, and things like that. But it got me interested in the stories around people's lives, the narratives that led to it, which weren't always linear, right? Mm-hmm. And that got me interested in the notion of portfolios. So I'm fond of saying it's a very sad story, but my honeymoon was an e-portfolio conference in 2004, but it was in France. And it was the first time I went to this EPIC conference. And I've sort of stayed at that EPIC conference ever since. And it's been about portfolios as a way of saying what you know and can do, lifelong, life-wide. And since 2012, when I brought Mozilla to the conference, badges and micro-credentials have been a way of doing that in more sort of progressive credential as you go kind of way. So that's what brings me here today, and it's an honor to be here.
So Donna, I just want to flag for you, sometimes your voice goes very low. So okay. You'll want to use your public keynote voice that I know you're amazing at doing because I've heard you in action. Thank you, sir. So it's an interesting point when you talk about building the roadmap for your life and thinking about sort of the threads that help to make access to work and learning more accessible and transparent and inclusive on many levels. I kind of want to pull some threads here. And I'm going to start with Nan, if you don't mind, Nan, putting you on the spot a little bit. But when you hear the word recognition, what does that mean in the context that we're talking about? Help me understand your perspective.
That's actually a really good question, Joanne. And this last May in Ireland, we had the 5th VPL, so Validation of Prior Learning Biennale. And we really took up that question about what is recognition. Our keynote speaker really looked at, what do we mean by recognition? And there are multiple ways that we are recognizing people all the time, anywhere from, saying their name, hi, how are you? I met Don at an e-portfolio conference years and years ago. So, there's ways of recognizing people as we go along. But when we start to talk about recognizing people in a more formal way, we have a tendency to, I think of it as having 4 types of recognition. We can recognize people, we can misrecognize them, which means that we recognize them from our own lens and we don't actually see them. We can, another version of that is not to recognize them, to sort of say, you don't belong and therefore you're not. And we can also only partially recognize them, saying that there's a piece here we'll recognize, but we're not going to recognize the rest of you. But when we start to look at that, all those versions of the no recognition are still dismissing people. And so from my perspective, there is only one type of recognition, and that is when we start to really listen to people, we hear what it is that they know and can do, and we have ways of being able to help them capture that. So when Dawn mentioned around portfolios, that's been a very traditional way of helping people kind of document what they know and can do so that somebody else can see it. When we think about that process, we're also asking people to do a self-recognition and then also being able to share that recognition out. And so that reflective process of doing a self-recognition, this is what I know and can do, becomes very, very important. There's limited research, but there is research that really supports that when people can go through that self-recognition process, they actually metacognitively learn it even deeper, and it becomes even more of something that they know. So there's some very valuable research in that area. But when we go to say, okay, now somebody else has to recognize that too, this is where we get into all those forms of does it have to fit what's already preconceived? Does it fit the curriculum? Is it a matching system? And as soon as you put it into those kinds of constraints, we are immediately dissing some of the knowledge and the abilities that that person has, because everything that's not there gets kind of sloughed to the side. So we do really a misrecognition at that point. So that whole aspect of how do we recognize people and be able to have ways of saying, okay, this knowledge fits in here. These are where your competencies or your skills fits in here. But we also see this other piece, and being able to bring all of somebody's learning into their learning pathways, to me, is where we need to be going in the whole recognition area.
It's interesting you say that, because when I think about the different forms of learning, workplace learning, outside the classroom, inside the classroom, collaborative learning, etc., it brings to mind what you said earlier, Christine, about the friend that did 2 years of study and then came back. This brings to my mind the intense focus on counting credits as being the only methodology for achieving recognition, for admissions, for transfer, etc. And I'm struck often when I think the history of credit counting. My research has indicated it was to capture faculty teaching hours, not intended probably when originally envisioned to be the sort of the core backbone of recognition practices at institutions and the like. What has your research found around this space about what is recognition? Can you kind of give some flavor to either in contrast or align with what Nan has shared?
Sure. Nan, the last few pieces you spoke about really resonated because, to be honest, I look at the communication and the information structures that actually facilitate credit transfer mobility in my research. And what I found there over the last couple decades have really been that we have some of those breakdowns in the former policies and procedures, as you state. When we try to fit them into the institutions or the systems in which we have to work is when we actually start to not have recognition. And the problems that we have there, I found overall, we really do have some, disagreements around, or some variations on the grading schemes and the scales. And for example, in the Ontario sector, when I was looking, there were about 10 different scales used, even among the universities, never mind the colleges. And then, as Joanne's alluded to, the actual credit counting and the hours in courses and what those look like, and the variations among the college and the university sectors within the system as a whole. In fact, British Columbia, knowing that the scales were so different among their institutions in Alberta, actually pulled these more into alignment, that they would all function on a 4-point scale, et cetera. So it's interesting to see how various jurisdictions have actually brought this in variations over time. But also in terms of the awarding of credits, sometimes we don't do a great job, I'll say, of informing students about how the credits can be applied and how they can be used. And so when we look at degree versus program requirements, and we're so focused on on the number, to Joanne's point. I really want to see that I actually received the 8 credits. But then how are those credits used? And if you actually are going to have those additional credits, we've seen all the wonderful studies actually of the United States in particular around the additional credits and graduating these credits that actually were not worthwhile in the sense of getting you to the end. Worthwhile learning. But this is the piece in terms of the counting towards the actual credential at the end. So I agree, we need to see more of a breakout in terms of the informal and the formal and the non-formal learning. All of those pieces that I would say in the Canadian system that CAPLA really, appreciates and has us pick up. But I also know in my own work right now where I sit here, we look at adult mature learning principles for admission. And we should do that because when we look at adult mature learning principles for admission, we actually get to see some of those learning, the recognition that we could provide for that learning, the scholar practitioner pieces versus just the scholarly pieces that we traditionally recognize, I'll say, within the academy. And I notice a great amount within this research over time, I'll say asymmetries and symmetries in information. And so when I say symmetries, we really can mean the same information, but it could be accurate information about the process or misaligned or missing information about the process, and then the asymmetries. And my research has found that there's a good amount of asymmetries between, institutional administrators, faculty members and their role in awarding credit, and then the students themselves. And the actual information and assumptions we make about how students should be able to interpret these systems, this credit counting, how it works, the review of the policies, the procedures, the textbooks. I could go on, but this is definitely a piece, Nan, that I really relate to here. And Joanne, I know you've done a lot of this work too. It's an area that we absolutely need to continue to focus on.
Well, and it brings an interesting point for me. And I do want to mention to our audience that if you have particular questions that you would like us to be further exploring, because there's a lot here, we're not going to solve it all in an hour, but there are some threads you might want to have me pull out, etc. Please feel free to put your questions or even your ideas in the Q&A. And I'll say the point about ideas as well. There are exemplar practices around the world where they seem to have got it right, or at least they're on the right path, or they're doing the kind of reflection to check those assumptions at the door, reflection and research. I would welcome those URLs. I would welcome those comments. And we will make sure we gather them up so that we can pay it forward after this session. But in terms of the questions themselves, don't hesitate to bring them in and I'll keep an eye for them. Dawn, when I think about what Nan and Christine have said, and I particularly want to jump on the point that Christine made about you have the administrators doing the credential evaluation through admissions. You have faculty colleagues weighing in on the policies and the decisions, senior level administrators also weighing in on that point. And you have the broader context, the instruments that are out there to help guide change, to help give reflection. Sometimes those instruments are legislative and very specific. They actually demand that credit counting, which makes it even harder when thinking about change. In your work with the international EPIC convenings that you've been holding and the open recognition community, how have you seen them try and tackle this? Or what suggestions would you bring to the table to address some of those assumptions or asynchronous activity?
So the way I would approach it is this notion of not only lifelong, but life-wide.
Life-wide, interesting.
Right. And life-wide in terms of recognition, not just life-wide learning, but life-wide recognition of learning. So what we've been talking about in the last few minutes is formal recognition for credit or for admission to programs, right? Which is important. It's great to have those credentials. I have one myself. My daughter is working on one now at University of Manitoba. Those are great. But what about recognition beyond the academy? What about recognition in the community, in the workplace, in your life? And how does that work? So you can have those credits lining up into, so for example, BC Campus, in the early days of micro-credentials, They said, okay, you're health professionals, the various health colleges have given you this credential, but how are you working with First Nations communities? What are your skills working with First Nations communities? How did you develop those skills? Well, you probably didn't develop them in class. You probably developed them in some kind of experiential context. And how can you communicate that? So this Paris Declaration on the equality of recognition is not saying that formal recognition is better than informal or vice versa. It's saying it's a fabric with many threads, and that each of them can complement each other and each of them can add value to each other. And it's more than that perspective of just simply counting the credits up to a qualification. It's relevance into different contexts. So if you're talking about transfer, maybe there's near transfer and far transfer, not just transfer of credit.
So that notion of creating a tapestry of opportunity for learners, stepping back from being too rigid in a particular way, but thinking through how a particular type of learning that may have been credentialed, not necessarily in a traditional setting, might help to augment understanding what the person is bringing to the table and the gifts they have. Sort of that concept of openness. I will say that the GDN signed to the EPIC Paris recognition statement. We're very proud to have contributed to that. From our original founding, our statutes make reference to access to work and learning. So I'm kind of curious as we probe this further, and maybe I'll ask Nan this question, but first, Dawn, did you want to do a follow-up?
Oh, just to say that part of that is setting up the articulation pathways from moving from formal, non-formal, informal, back out again. And even a formal credential needs to be socially recognized in order for it to have weight out in society, right? So there's a notion of socialization of these things in a broader context of society. So just to leave it there.
Well, this is where sort of the trust in that credential, whether it emerged from a workplace, non-workplace, or traditional learning experience, is probably important, would you say? Yeah.
And trust is one of those things that people like to say, it comes in on foot, leaves on horseback. And it can be triangulated. It's not necessarily a single point of trust because it's on a blockchain. It can be a number of signals give you some idea of trust. It can be more organic than many people may define it as.
So, Nan, when you think about this space and you think about the tremendous research that you've done in the field, and I encourage people to take a look at the Credentials as you go website to get a real feel for that. But what is your sense of some of what Dawn has shared here? How do you think we can do this?
So there's a couple of things that I'd like to bring up that I think build on what Dawn was talking about. One has to do with the way in which we think about the learners. And, when we get into things like recognition and transfer, what we're thinking is we really come at this in higher education and also in the workforce, that we're the center. And we talk about learners having all kinds of pathways going in and out, and our language often, even if we're trying to do it in the kindest way, they've stepped away from education or something like that. It's always about somehow that the learner has, in many ways, abandoned us. I mean, we actually take it almost as an offense, like somehow aren't they going to just stay with us and finish what we think they should do? And if you stop and talk with learners, they're on pathways that and many times they're seeing education and work coming in and out of their life. And so we have to be rethinking about how we kind of align to the learners' pathways, because in their life, they're not they're not bouncing in and out, they're moving along in their life. We provide them a service when it's needed for them. So in that also, at our institution and for many years, and I've been in the prior learning assessment world for over 30 years. So I've had and I've done it from being somebody who got credit all the way up to running programs. So I've seen many areas of that, and I've done quite a bit of research on it. When we think about the learners coming from from a higher ed perspective, coming from the work and having learning that's taken place, we often will approach this as though we have the expertise to know whether or not somebody has learned something in the workplace. And so some of the work that we did was to take this from a different perspective, and it touches what Dawn was talking about in terms of trust. In the workplace, when somebody's evaluated to do a job, they're going through an evaluation process. And we don't fire our students when they don't do well, but you do get fired on the job if you don't do well. And you're promoted when you do usually a good job. And so we started looking at, can we look at the competencies that are being evaluated in the workplace and using that as part of our evaluation of the learning that we could translate then to credit. And so we've done a lot of different examples of how we worked with industry partners and used their evaluation process as part of the information about what somebody knows and can do. Then we ran into this whole question about what is credit worthy. And I always ask faculty the question, if you have a 10-year-old that was raised, let's say, in a Spanish-speaking home, and they can read and write in Spanish, they can translate for family members, these kinds of things. And then you take let's say a freshman who's never had Spanish, and they take Spanish 101 in the curriculum. Why is the Spanish 101 course considered credit worthy, and the 10-year-old who knows the language inside and out from a lived experience not considered credit worthy? And so we tried to get our hands around, how do you even know what is college level learning when you think about our university level learning? We really have tried to figure out what makes it to be recognized in certain circumstances and not in others. So another example, we were working with a partner in New York State, the Department of Motor Vehicles, and they wanted us to evaluate the training that they were doing for their frontline workers for college credit. The thing is that it's a lot of very nuanced, specific learning for how to do their job, and less of that idea that it's transferable learning that we think of sort of in the higher ed idea that what you learn can be applied to other things. And so the thing is that these individuals also, many of them, first of all, didn't see themselves as college material, that they couldn't survive in college. They also didn't see themselves as, in many ways, didn't meet the qualifications to be accepted into a university. And when we started to look at the learning that was taking place, there were competencies that they were learning that could be recognized, that could be developed into a pathway, almost thinking about prerequisites, thinking about how that helps people become able to do the curriculum requirements and such. Even though again, we get away from this idea of this match, like you've got the learning that can line up to this particular course, and therefore we'll either transfer it or recognize it through a PLAR process or whatever. But thinking much broader in that, in terms of what are the pathways that people really can go along, and can we recognize that to help them along the pathway? It may not be for a specific credential. It may be that we create other kinds of credentials, and that's what, you know, the micro credentials or badges, et cetera, so that they have some way of saying, I've got this, and somebody else can say, yeah, you do. But it really gets into this whole question about the start and stop points. And that for the learner, and this gets back to this idea that the learner is on a pathway. And what can we be doing in that recognition process to be helping them along the pathway instead of thinking of it as gatekeepers, like, yes, you can come and you can study here and we can give you a degree, or no, you can't. And so I really think we have to be switching the way that we think about the role of education.
So one of the things that one of the presenters actually at the GDN PCCAT convening in May, that'll be on May 28th to 30th, will also be a gentleman from UNESCO, Dr. Bahrain Shakroun, who is the director of lifelong learning at UNESCO. And he talks often about the importance of exactly that, Nan, which is thinking about it differently, thinking about recognition in a more rounded way, the way all of you are describing. And I'm going to kind of think that I first want to frame my question, and then I'm going to ask Christine to go next. But when I think about this and I think about why can't we do this? Like, what is it that's preventing us from doing this work and considering the whole life cycle of learning when someone comes to us? I look at the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. Some of what all of you have been describing, it could fit within each of those levels or one or the other. So Christina, I kind of want to start at the macro level. In your research, in your experience, in your walk, what are some examples at the macro level where you think the policies are the right instruments, or maybe it was from your HECO work, et cetera, or that you know of as exemplars around the world with your work in the tuning project? Is there anything at the macro level, an instrument or an approach that you would call out that kind of seemed to have gotten it right?
Sure. I think one of the larger pieces actually that I did in tandem with the Ontario Council on Articulation and Transfer, ONCAT, was actually looking across institutions and across countries and jurisdictions about learning outcomes approaches. And we all have feelings probably about learning outcomes approaches. However, we actually partnered with 5 international scholars over a 2-year project to look at where they all had approaches in these countries, learning outcomes. And some were done beautifully, and some had issues, and some failed terribly. And were overthrown by the instructors in the institutions because they were coming from the top down. One of the largest things we found there is that, it's not learning outcomes. And so I'm not saying that that is a piece here, but it's learning outcomes in tandem with other understandings. And one of the pieces we found there was the time on task was really important. We also found there that it was the modes of learning. To Dawn's point earlier, there are various modes in which this learning occurs, and sometimes we need to recognize that. And Nan, to your point, it's also the context and the environments of the learning. We found that some of those, for example, in the United Kingdom, where there had been a learning outcomes approach, but then it had been more nuanced over time to have some of that time on task and have some of that context, and that these things were done from the ground up with the educators on board. I think one of the biggest pieces we see in the policies and procedures is that they're enforced, or they're traditional, or they're historical, or there were reasons for them down the road. And in some of those situations in this international research we found where things were overthrown when it came to articulation, credit transfer, mobility, lifelong and life-wide learning, I love that, Dawn, was really those moments where educators, I think, were butting up against some of the policies and procedures that weren't supporting what students actually, had to bring forward, or, what learners had to bring forward. And so in those moments, being able to draw on various facets of learning, I'll say, and a multifaceted dimension of the learner, in those jurisdictions where that was possible, there seemed to be more success, because the educators and the institutional administrators had more of an understanding of the various facets of learning. We take that that for granted sitting here. We've all bought into that. We understand that work. But that knowledge in the ground up, those what we called really, the truth circles, and in the truth and the trust circles was really important, because the truth there in terms of what learners bring, and instead of that they don't swirl, they are on their various paths, as Nan said. And so our language can sometimes be very, it can cut people down and it can provide stigma. But in those moments where we're able to provide the education with those trust circles and understand that we are building on the trust and, what students are bringing forward and what learners have in their back pocket and are trying to bring for us, we actually notice that that's where there seemed to be the most, collaboration. And it really is a work of collaboration, because those, faculty members often are used to evaluate credit, to look at credit, and yet they actually are not aware of some of these very discussions we're having and how there can be variations, and how within their institutional policies and procedures, there actually are ways of providing. There are exceptions, and any one of our registrars and our Senate and our academic calendar regulations, I will say, especially in this position, there are exceptions, and we can definitely yield those. And so I think what we saw is the top-down approaches tended to be very problematic. We had examples from Australia and from South Africa where things had actually kind of been overturned and overthrown, whereas some of those more from the United Kingdom and some of the European countries and Scandinavian countries on board in that work actually had a little more of a collaborative communication structure where folks were more on par with one another than separate. And I think that that's really, where we need to come to. And I have a bias. Communication structures is one of the pieces I study here, but it is so important because it's where the breakdown actually I find occurs a lot of the time.
So I just want to mention, do a bit of a call out for a couple of instruments that I'm aware of. And Dawn, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit more about the Paris Declaration. The GDN has a series of ethical principles. Our focus is on learner mobility through credential mobility, as well as through data portability and the underlying information to help learners. But we do that within a broader context, and that includes the Sustainable Development Goals that UNESCO has, as well as an instrument called the Global Recognition Convention, which actually is seeking to recognize lifelong learning, as my colleagues here have described it. So if I had one suggestion, and I have always many, but one suggestion to our audience today as a takeaway is to consider actually reviewing those larger instruments like the Paris Declaration for EPIC, like the GDN statutory ethical principles, and the Global Convention. And looking at it, they can be heavy reading sometimes, but looking at it with an eye to that lifelong learning piece, because it might help to offset some of what you've raised, Christine, about the different communities that exist in our various institutions, in the employment world and the like, and how do we work to build bridges? Sometimes I find that broader instruments like that can help a little bit. So I just want to, I want to give you, Dawn, a chance. How do you feel the EPIC recognition declaration will make a difference? And I know you've put the links in the chat. So what's your aspirational hope for that?
I think I would come at that through the doorway of what are we trying to achieve with education and development. I think what we're trying to develop is a society that moves forward together, where everyone feels they can play a part, where everyone feels they're capable. And so what we're building is not necessarily knowledge domains, we're building capabilities, broad-based capabilities. And it's interesting that Christine worked for HECO, because I remember there was a study at HECO where they said, how do we develop those graduate learning outcomes over the period of 2 years or 4 years? And there was no, it was a black box, essentially. It was a black box. So they had to do a PIAC test at the beginning and a PIAC test at the end and say, oh, look, see, difference. But they couldn't talk about the mechanism that happened. And so I just attributed it to the cruel and unusual punishment of going through a post-secondary education. You have the scars or skills to show for it. So the Paris Declaration is the idea where recognition is an ethic. That's actually one of the principles of it. It's recognition practices can be susceptible to bias, so that there needs to be an ethical practice around it. And recognition, as Nan was saying, is a fundamental human practice. We begin with recognition. That was a wonderful moment in the keynote of the VPL Biennale, where Ted Fleming was talking about that. We start being recognized as a child, and we flower within that recognition. We feel activated, we feel effective, and we grow within that. And then there's the notion that recognition is not something that just comes from the top down, is you recognize yourself, you recognize your peers, you recognize the people who are guiding you. So somebody says, who has that saying, was, tell me who you respect and I'll tell you about yourself. Right? So in other words, what guides you and what do you recognize? So then, and then this notion of trust, building those trust relationships, we've already talked about that. And then I was mentioning earlier, the act of recognition is a social act. I can have a qualification, but if it's not recognized, who cares? It's a tree that's fallen in the forest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal qualification. It could be a non-formal workplace qualification, or it can be simply a letter of recommendation that can help me make a transition into a different part of society that I want to join. And then there's the notion of a lot of talk about micro-credentials, about qualifications, is about individuals. And really we need to start thinking more collectively, is because how many things are actually done just by an individual? Typically, it's an individual working with other people. So what are the collective skills of a small to medium-sized enterprise? What are the collective skills of a region like the lower mainland in BC, which Credex explored, led by the Vancouver Community College? How can a region become a learning region? How can it become more effective? So those are the kinds of themes that we explore every year, and Paris Declaration is simply the latest expression of it. It began with something called the Bologna Open Recognition Declaration back in 2016, which is sort of a cheeky response to the Bologna Accord back then.
So it's interesting you raise Europe. Europe's been doing some really wonderful work in the recognition space, and the ENIC NARICs are very important partners in that process. There's an example of one where they have created a tool where if you had a micro-credential, you could go in, answer several questions, and it would provide guidance for understanding what more research you need to do. New Zealand's been interesting, as have been some other regions where they've actually taken different types of credentials like micro-credentials and attempted to line them up to their qualifications framework to, at the system level, enable these points of opening up recognition, if you will, in the spirit of a context where there's a highly formalized, rigid kind of, I wouldn't say rigid, but it's not, most communities have some kind of credential qualification framework. And most of them build on traditional credentials. Although there are some, such as in my region in Ontario, where they actually are recognizing different types of certificates to sort of open up learning, et cetera. Nan, in your research, or Christine, in your research, which is world research, have you seen some examples at the maybe at the meso level where systems have created mechanisms that have helped to do exactly what you're proposing, which is open up recognition? And maybe I'll ask Nan first.
So I think I'll come at that a couple ways. With the Credential as You Go work, our first research project was to do a landscape analysis across the United States in terms of what was happening with credentialing. That was really you know, what is going on there. And out of that, we developed we have the incremental credentialing framework. Now, we use the word incremental credentialing to try to have an umbrella terminology that is showing that all of these credentials are along a pathway. So they're increments to a pathway, and that includes a degree is also on a pathway. In the incremental credentialing framework, what we were able to see are these patterns of the ways in which just that question about how are we opening up recognition. And so some of the, you know, just very, very quickly, you know, some were focused on skill development, some were on specialization. We hear a lot about stackability. So really thinking about what are those true pathways, transfer, looking at how credentials can transfer across, working with partnerships. But another piece was what we've termed as kind of retro as you go, looking back and saying, okay, we know lots of people, you know, as I said at the very beginning, 1 out of 6 adults in the United States that have some college but no credential. And how do you go back and start to capture that and credential it so that you're actually going and capturing that and giving them some other ways of doing that. When Dawn talked about the collective, I think this is an incredibly important point, is that learning does not take place in isolation, and the way that we assess learners for what they know and can do is in isolation. And so by looking at the individual and pulling it out of the context, we lose a lot of what people know and can do. And so we are seeing some work that's really, I mean, some of the portfolio work went that way, but we're seeing some additional work. Thank you, Don, for putting that in the chat for me. What we're seeing is really thinking about how to take the collective and then helping a person be able to place themselves within the collective. So this is my body of knowledge. This is how it relates to the bigger body of knowledge. And these are the newer parts that maybe I'm involved in too. We have learners at our institution that have more knowledge in particular areas than our faculty do. Our faculty learn from the students when they go through a recognition process. And so thinking about it in terms of, you know, there are ways of knowing that we need to learn from each other, and that, you know, that our curriculum can actually change based on the learners who are coming in and the kinds of knowledge that they have. And so we really have to be thinking about how we get more flexible and be able to grow the curriculum and the pathways based on the kinds of things that people know.
It's interesting when I reflect on what you're saying, there's so many threads that I could be pulling here. It's definitely complex. It's multifaceted. I keep coming back to my mind's eye that each community has its own motivations, shall we say, or requirements some might offer, or et cetera, et cetera. Have any of you done any research where we've looked closely at sort of the skills that employers are looking for and how we might round or extend our recognition practices to consider that space?
I have, but I don't want to jump in if Christine has wanted to say something.
No, I'll jump in quickly. I think without a doubt, when we've seen across the Canadian provinces, a real focus on experiential learning and work integrated learning. I think almost every province in Canada over the last decade has had a target or a mission, we will say, with various attributes attributed to it in terms of those experiences for students. When we are at that level, encouraging students to have those work integrated learning, experiential learning opportunities, we also really do need to make sure that we are, to your point, point, Joanne, actually including those within the recognition that we're providing for students, and that we're educating on them about how really to express those skills, those competencies, etc. And so I will say, I think there is a level at which if we're really putting a focus on that, we need to make sure in the mobility world, we're looking at that as well then, because they should be able to come on out and speak about those pieces and have them recognized and interpreted. I think that's where the practitioner piece of our learning, we've seen a real shift from just the academic to the, kind of scholar practitioner, academic practitioner. If we really are bringing that into the classroom, part of the learning experience, we need to make sure that it's paralleled on the other side and that we have the abilities to do that. I think the colleges, Ontario, and the research I've done there, Joanne, do this really well. We have the, employability skills and attributes, and these pieces are lined a lot more together. But what we're seeing from some of the universities, and there's some really great Southampton University in the United States and others, they actually have mapping of their programs, all of their programs, all 65, to actually these skills and attributes for students. And that's really important because, as Nan is stating, we can actually see where we could provide that learning versus just based on a course level. So if we look at the unit of recognition, we actually have to look a little more at those competency statements and skills versus maybe the unit or course or credit hours. I think it's a shift in how we actually look at the unit of measurement sometimes. And I think that that's where I've seen a lot of this work start to move and take place. But Nan, I'm going to hand it over to you because I know you have a lot to offer here.
Oh, I was just going to address your question, Joanne, in terms of research. And so we did a research study. I had a faculty team working with me. And we looked at, what are all the competencies that we kind of looked across the board in terms of what industry is saying are essential for people to be successful in the workplace these days. And our question was also, what are the competencies that are essential to be successful in higher education, and how well do they align? Because, we kept hearing about how higher ed isn't preparing people for the workplace. When we looked at that and we looked at the intersection, we found it was the same body of competencies and so really what we're talking about are competencies in terms of what does it take to learn and apply your learning and being able to take it to the next level. The one thing that we found was that higher ed and industry were using some different words, but they meant the same. They were, but they also tended to treat each one as its own thing, like problem solving, creativity, as though they aren't connected. And so what we did is we created a framework. We're calling it the essential competencies. So we clustered them and actually kind of created kind of a way of bringing them together. But what was even more important is that what the faculty realized, who were part of this research, was that we typically talk about, let's say, a typical one thing we hear about is, people need to be team players. All right. So we, in higher education, in our curriculum, we sort of say, okay, they're going to do this group project, or they're going to do this, and they're going to develop, the competency of being a team player through, kind of through osmosis of this work. Our faculty asked, what if we flipped that? What if we taught these different competencies and infused the topics? So, for example, one of our faculty members had been teaching a general science for non-science majors, and it was everybody, all the students complained about it. She completely redesigned her curriculum and did it off of our framework using the competencies, and then infused the science in there. And so as they were doing things in teams, they were doing things with science, but their focus was on being a team player. So as a result, that course got completely redesigned, and now it is so popular that she has to have multiple sections of it. So I think, when Christine talks about that unit of measure, we really have to be thinking about what is the real purpose of what we're trying to do, and what are those measures of what we're really trying to accomplish. And that's where I think we can get to the micro level of what we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
So it's interesting, one of our audience members has asked the tough question, and this is specific to the education realm. It's not the workplace realm, but some of what you're sharing makes me think of it. And if I was to ask you your top advice for how to help faculty be prepared to think about this new way, or more broad way, shall we say, of recognition and learning, what would be your advice? And I'm going to start with Dawn on this one.
I was blogging about the HESA. Dropped the link from the HESA blog today, which is an interview with Stephen Mintz, and he actually has some great hints about how to do that. Basically, he says faculty are pretty much the only professionals who don't do professional education, who aren't mandated to do professional education. They're persuaded to do professional education, the scholarship of teaching and learning, etc. So I think his idea is to give them the experiential learning of learning how to do this in the flow of the work that they do. And I think
Right.
eCampus Ontario, for example, does that as well with its empowered educator and fluent digital fluency and doing that kind of thing. So in other words, doing stuff, and I sometimes say in different circles, badging the badger. So in other words, recognizing the recognizer so that they know how it feels and they know they have that immersion in the kind of experiential learning that you're trying to do.
So a couple of threads here, one of them being help them build their knowledge, help encourage this kind of different approach to teaching and learning, and also recognizing what the place and space they're coming from. Nan, we have a little bit of time. I want one short suggestion from you. How do we help faculty in this space?
So I work with faculty all the time in this space, across our country and in other locations. And one of the main questions I ask is, what are you really trying to accomplish with your learners? And let's start there. So
Excellent. And I'm going to give the last word to Christine, and then I'm going to wrap us up. Christine, quickly, one final thought.
I do. I really believe that we need the teach-ins that Dawn stated, whether that be SOTL, the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, or, actually modalities of learning and how we can recognize them. I will say British Columbia has transfer articulation committees, TACs, and I think these are really interesting examples of how we could actually pull together faculty to have a discussion about what is taking place within your field, the changes, what we can recognize, lab requirements, time, those levels of communication that they could have and build on, not just within their institution, but also across institutions, really does yield a understanding of the field and where it sits within, I think, the larger ecosystem of post-secondary education. And those TACs are really important for building that understanding and common understanding.
So I just want to thank my panelists today for helping to educate me and our community with the area that is recognition and the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. We're going to be continuing this dialogue at the May 28th to 30th convening at Centennial College in Toronto this spring. Centennial College is a GDN signatory, and I would ask that people consider joining us, helping to continue the conversation. My colleagues here will be part of that experience. We're going to have workshops, sessions, and the like, and we're doing it in partnership with the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer. We have a similar convening in Oslo in October, the end of October, which is nicely tied to just after the EPIC convening in Paris, so that more of these conversations can happen. And there's a few other convenings that are nicely lined up with these other two. So I do hope that for those who are looking to save travel time, you think about bundling some of these opportunities together. I work remotely and recommend it highly for many if that's an issue. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure. We have several links that are in the chat. We will be providing the recording. We always have it in our GDN video library. We will also make sure we publish it on our site. So thank you for that question in the Q&A. Thank you, friends. Have a great week. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your expertise today.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Opportunity.
Thank you, Joanne.
Bye-bye.